You ever notice how they don't take control with one big announcement? They take it with updates. That's what this 2026 motorcycle law is. A quiet rule that turns a bike into something that can be watched, logged, and managed, and riders are calling it what it is, a digital leash. Because the second your bike becomes a rolling data machine, the question isn't, is it collecting? The question is, who gets to see it, and when? Watch till the end, because I'm going to show you the part nobody's ready for. How this doesn't stop at the factory. It follows you straight into insurance, service, and resale. The rule that passed without a fight. The law did not arrive with sirens, press conferences, or shouting headlines. It slipped through quietly, filed under routine regulatory updates, buried in the kind of language most people never read unless forced to. By the time it surfaced in public conversation, it was already finished, signed, scheduled, locked in for 2026. There was no televised debate aimed at riders, no hearings framed around everyday ownership, no pause for public feedback from the people most affected. The rule appeared fully formed, as if discussion had already happened somewhere else, with someone else in the room. Most people first noticed it, not through news coverage, but through fragments. A dealer memo, a compliance notice, a line item buried in a manufacturer briefing. Each mention felt incomplete on its own. Together, they suggested something larger had already moved past the point of challenge. The timing mattered. This did not follow a crisis. There was no sudden spike that forced emergency action. Instead, it arrived during relative quiet, when attention was elsewhere and resistance was unlikely to organize in time. That silence is what made it unsettling. Major changes rarely announce themselves this softly, unless friction is expected. When a rule that alters ownership dynamics moves without confrontation, it raises a simple question that lingers longer than any headline. If nobody was asked, who decided this was settled? That question leads directly to the next issue. Because once a rule exists, the only thing that matters is whether it can be avoided. Once the rule was discovered, the next concern was immediate and practical. Was there any room left to say no? Compliance is not optional. The answer turned out to be straightforward, and that was part of the problem. The language left no ambiguity. This was not a guideline. It was not a recommendation. It was a condition. Any new motorcycle entering the market under the 2026 framework would be required to meet the standard. No alternative configuration was listed. No exemption pathway was described. Compliance was framed as a prerequisite, not a choice. That clarity removed negotiation from the equation. There was no opt-out clause tied to usage, location, or ownership history. No distinction between touring miles or short rides. The rule applied at the point of entry, long before a bike ever touched pavement. If a machine did not meet the requirement, it would not be sold as compliant. That was the entirety of the decision tree. What stood out was not the firmness, but the absence of contingency. Past regulations often left space for adaptation. This one did not. The structure assumed acceptance, not debate. It treated compliance as an administrative step, like paperwork or labeling, rather than a shift in relationship. The wording suggested that disagreement had already been accounted for and dismissed. Once that reality set in, the conversation moved away from whether the rule could be avoided. Attention shifted to something harder to define. Why did this feel heavier than previous mandates? The answer did not sit in the text itself, but in how it changed the balance between owner and machine, with no option to decline. The focus turned to why this requirement felt unlike anything that came before. If this breakdown matters to you, support the channel by liking this video, subscribing for future updates, and sharing your perspective below. Why the word leash keeps coming up. The reaction did not center on safety, cost, or complexity. It centered on control. That is why a single word kept surfacing in conversations that otherwise shared little in common. Leash. Not because of how the rule worked, but because of what it implied. A leash does not prevent movement. It redefines who decides where movement happens. Previous regulations addressed outcomes. This one addressed behavior. That distinction matters. Ownership has always carried responsibility, but it also carried discretion. The assumption was simple. Once the machine was purchased, the decisions belonged to the person holding the keys. The new framework blurred that line. It did not remove ownership on paper, but it introduced supervision into a space that had previously been private. That shift changed the tone immediately. Conversations became quieter, more measured. People were not debating performance or features. They were trying to articulate why this felt different. The answer was not nostalgia or resistance to change. It was the sense that an invisible presence had been introduced into a relationship that had always been direct. Rider, machine, road. When discretion narrows, language changes. Words like leash appear not as slogans, but as shorthand for a loss that is hard to quantify. The rule did not announce supervision explicitly. It made it implicit. And that implication carried weight long before any consequences were visible. That weight remained abstract until the moment it stopped being theoretical and started showing up in real life. A lot of people ask about my gear and accessories. They're all in the description if you want to check them out. I stand by them. The moment it became real. The first incident did not involve spectacle. There was no dramatic stop or confrontation. It was administrative, a routine interaction that ended differently than expected. Paperwork flagged. A system response triggered. The rider involved did not set out to test the rule. The rule found them. What mattered was not the outcome, but the realization. The law was not waiting for the future. It was already present, already active, already shaping interactions in ways that felt unfamiliar. The encounter was brief, but the effect lingered. It introduced a new awareness that stayed long after the moment passed. Word traveled quietly, the same way the rule had arrived. Through conversations, not broadcasts, each retelling stripped away assumptions. This was no longer a discussion about what might happen. It was confirmation that the framework was live, and that its reach extended beyond theory. Nothing dramatic followed, no immediate escalation. But something had shifted. The law had crossed from text to experience. Once that happens, it cannot be unseen. From that point forward, every conversation would carry that knowledge, even when it went unspoken. What the law requires, in plain language, stripped of interpretation and commentary. The law is precise about one thing. The motorcycle must be capable of being continuously observed through built-in systems that remain active during operation. The requirement is not tied to optional use cases or special conditions. It is written as a baseline capability, meaning the system must exist, must function, and must remain available as long as the motorcycle is in service. The wording does not describe a temporary state or an emergency-only function. It defines a persistent condition. The text avoids metaphor and avoids explanation. It does not say why this capability is needed in mechanical terms. It simply states that the motorcycle must support it. That distinction matters. When a requirement is written without scenario limits, it applies universally. The system does not activate only when something happens. It is assumed to be present at all times, regardless of circumstance. There is also no language suggesting manual disengagement. The requirement is framed as inherent, not elective. Once installed, it becomes part of the machine's operating state. The law treats this capability the same way it treats lighting standards or identification markings. It is not described as a feature, it is described as a condition of legality. Nothing in the text explains how often the system is accessed or by whom. That omission is intentional. The law concerns itself only with capability, not usage. Once capability is mandated, everything else becomes possible. Understanding that difference is critical, because it leads directly to the next question. Once information exists, where does it go? The requirement creates information by default, which raises a second issue that the law does not answer directly: where the information goes. The regulation does not describe the information as static. It treats it as transferable. Language referring to access, availability, and authorized recipients appears throughout the text. What is absent is any statement that the information remains contained within the motorcycle itself. There is no clause establishing isolation. The structure assumes movement. References to third parties appear without definition. The term is used broadly, without narrowing language. That matters because broad terms expand by default. A third party is not named, categorized, or limited. It is simply acknowledged as an endpoint. Once acknowledged, access becomes a matter of process rather than permission. The law also avoids timelines. There is no expiration date attached to the information once it is collected. There is no instruction for deletion after a certain period. The absence of a time boundary implies retention, not disposal. When retention is implied, distribution becomes easier over time, not harder. There is also no mention of notification. The regulation does not require that access events be disclosed. It does not require acknowledgement when information changes hands. That silence creates a one-way structure. Information moves outward, but confirmation does not move back. This design is not accidental. It reflects a familiar administrative pattern. Systems are built to share first, explain later. The law establishes the channel and leaves governance for another document, another moment, another rule-making process. That separation leads naturally to the public explanation offered for why such access is necessary. With pathways established, the next question becomes how this structure is justified in plain terms. Why safety is the official shield. The justification appears early and often. Safety. The word is used as a stabilizer, a framing device, and a conclusion. It appears without elaboration, as if its presence alone resolves concern. The regulation does not define the term beyond its general meaning. It relies on shared assumption rather than specific demonstration. This approach follows precedent. When broad authority is introduced, safety is the language that draws the least resistance. It is difficult to oppose without appearing reckless. That is why it is effective. The law does not argue that the system improves outcomes in measurable ways. It simply asserts alignment with protection. What matters is not whether safety is relevant, but how it is used. In this case, it functions as a shield. It deflects inquiry rather than invites it. By placing safety at the center, the structure discourages further questioning about scope, duration, or oversight. The implication is that these concerns are secondary once protection is invoked. The text does not cite comparative standards or past performance. It does not reference studies or outcomes. It assumes acceptance. That assumption allows the framework to expand without re-argument. Once safety is established as the foundation, additional capabilities can be layered on without revisiting the original premise. This rhetorical structure is efficient. It has been used before in other regulatory contexts. Understanding that pattern matters because it explains why the law contains another provision that receives far less attention. Beneath the stated purpose sits a section that quietly determines how far the rule can reach. The clause that allows expansion. Near the end of the regulation sits language that appears procedural. It addresses updates, revisions, and compatibility with future standards. On its surface, it reads like housekeeping. In practice, it is the most consequential section in the document. It establishes that compliance is not frozen at the moment of passage. The clause allows for modification through administrative action rather than legislative review. That distinction is critical. It means adjustments can occur without reopening debate or seeking renewed approval. The structure assumes continuity, not interruption. Once the framework exists, it can be expanded internally. There is no requirement that future changes be presented as separate mandates. They can be incorporated as refinements or clarifications. That language matters because it determines how visibility functions over time. Changes can occur gradually, each one framed as minor, even when their cumulative effect is significant. The clause also avoids defining limits. It does not specify which elements are subject to update and which are not. By avoiding boundaries, it preserves flexibility for the authority overseeing the system. Flexibility in regulation translates to discretion in practice. This provision does not predict what will be added. It does not need to. Its function is structural. It ensures that the rule is not a fixed object, but a living framework. Once that is understood, the law stops being a single event and starts being a platform. The cost doesn't stay at the top, the first place. The pressure shows is not at the corporate level. It appears lower, quieter, and closer to the ground. Independent shops feel it before anyone else does. Compliance requires updates, certifications, and coordination that were not part of their operating reality before. None of these changes are free, and none are optional. When margins are already thin, even modest increases reshape daily decisions. Shops begin adjusting in predictable ways. Labor hours stretch. Certain services take longer. Some work becomes harder to quote with confidence. The added administrative layer does not replace mechanical labor. It sits on top of it. That stack changes pricing without announcing itself as a price increase. Customers notice the difference without always knowing where it comes from. Manufacturers pass requirements down the chain, but they do not absorb the cost indefinitely. Distributors adjust terms, shops adjust rates. Buyers absorb the remainder. The rule does not create a single visible fee. It creates a slow accumulation of smaller ones. Over time, those add up to a measurable shift in ownership cost. None of this is framed as punishment. It is described as alignment. But alignment still has a price, and that price settles where resistance is lowest. Once that reality becomes routine, attention shifts from service counters to something even more abstract, yet just as influential. After shops adjust to new costs, another system begins quietly recalibrating behind the scenes. How insurance begins to recalculate. Insurance does not react emotionally, it reacts mathematically. When new information becomes available, models adapt. Monitoring changes the input set. And when inputs change, pricing logic follows. This is not framed as a penalty. It is framed as refinement. The language emphasizes accuracy, not restriction. Risk is no longer inferred solely from age, location, or history. It is supplemented by behavior patterns. That shift matters because behavior is variable. A static profile becomes dynamic. Premiums are no longer anchored to broad categories alone. They adjust as data accumulates. This does not happen all at once. Initial changes appear modest. A recalibration here, a reevaluation there. Over time, patterns emerge. Some policies become more expensive, others become less so. The system presents this as balance, not bias. Each adjustment is justified internally by reference to consistency. What matters is leverage. When behavior becomes legible, it becomes actionable. Pricing follows patterns, not intentions. The structure does not ask why something happened. It records that it did. That distinction allows recalculation without confrontation. Once that logic is normalized, it stops feeling new. It becomes part of the background. Attention then shifts away from pricing models and toward the everyday experience of ownership itself. As costs and premiums adjust, the meaning of ownership begins to feel less settled than it once did. If you want to stay ahead of changes like this, make sure you're subscribed. New laws and policies move fast, and future videos will break them down clearly, calmly, and early before they become normal and impossible to question later. Ownership still exists. Control shrinks. On paper, nothing has changed. Titles still transfer. Registrations still renew. The legal definition of ownership remains intact. In practice, the experience feels narrower. Decisions that once belonged entirely to the owner now occur within a framework that notices and records them. This does not manifest as constant interference. Most rides proceed without interruption. The shift is subtler. Awareness changes behavior. Knowing that systems are present influences choices, even when no feedback is given. Control becomes conditional without being explicitly revoked. Maintenance routines adjust, modifications are reconsidered, not because they are prohibited, but because they interact with requirements that did not exist before. The machine still responds mechanically, but its context has changed. Ownership now includes compliance as a background condition. This is not about permission. It is about friction. Small constraints accumulate. Each one is manageable. Together, they alter the rhythm of use. What once felt private now feels observed, even when observation is passive. Nothing dramatic marks this transition. There is no single moment when control disappears. It erodes through normalization. The result is a form of ownership that looks familiar but behaves differently. Once that reality settles in, explanations from above begin to sound more rehearsed. As practical control narrows, attention turns to how these changes are explained by those who introduced them. The official justification. Public statements follow a consistent pattern. The language emphasizes modernization, efficiency, and inevitability. Change is framed as progress, not choice. Resistance is described as misunderstanding rather than disagreement. The tone is calm, assured, and forward-looking. Officials point to alignment with broader standards. They describe the rule as part of a necessary update, not a deviation. The implication is that adaptation is the natural response. Those who question the change are encouraged to see it as temporary discomfort in service of long-term benefit. The justification avoids specifics. It does not dwell on edge cases or individual experiences. It speaks in aggregates, safety, consistency, future readiness. These terms function as closure rather than explanation. They signal that the decision has already been made and that discussion is no longer productive. This language does not escalate. It settles. It presents the outcome as settled fact rather than contested choice. Over time, repetition reinforces acceptance. The rule becomes part of the landscape, and justification becomes background noise. Once that tone takes hold, the conversation moves. Beyond immediate consequences, attention shifts outward, toward what this framework makes possible next. Why motorcycles were the first test. Motorcycles were not selected by chance. Regulatory systems tend to begin with sectors that are visible, fragmented, and less unified in representation. Motorcycles meet all three conditions. The market is smaller than passenger vehicles, divided across manufacturers and segments, and spread across many ownership patterns. That fragmentation reduces coordinated resistance, making implementation smoother at an early stage. The machines themselves also simplify rollout. Motorcycles occupy less infrastructure, generate lower data volume per unit, and interact with fewer external systems. That reduction in complexity lowers the risk of early failure. When a framework operates successfully in a simpler environment, it becomes easier to justify expansion later. This is not preference. It is procedural strategy. There is also historical precedent. Motorcycles have often absorbed regulatory change earlier than other vehicle categories. Safety equipment standards, emissions updates, and classification rules arrived here first. Each shift normalized oversight incrementally. That history conditions expectation and reduces surprise. From a planning perspective, motorcycles offer a controlled environment. Success here becomes proof of concept elsewhere. Once established, questions shift away from feasibility toward scalability. This sequencing preserves authority while minimizing early disruption and administrative risk across the system. By starting small and controlled, oversight can be refined without drawing widespread resistance or attention. Once the test case is established and normalized, momentum shifts. The focus no longer rests on justification, but on coordination. Institutions begin reorganizing around the framework, aligning processes, standards, and responsibilities to support something already treated as settled and operational reality. How this reshapes policy battles. Once a framework exists, institutional alignment begins to shift. Agencies tasked with oversight gain a shared reference point. Coordination becomes easier when data structures and standards are unified. What was once debated in principle becomes discussed in terms of implementation. Policy debates narrow as a result. The presence of an operational system changes the terrain. Discussions focus less on whether monitoring belongs in regulation and more on how it should be administered. That shift advantages institutions already invested in the framework. Industry groups adjust accordingly. Some align to influence refinements rather than oppose the foundation. Others redirect resources toward compliance assistance. The conversation becomes technical rather than philosophical. That change in tone matters because it alters outcomes without appearing confrontational. Legislative attention follows similar patterns. Once a system is active, revisiting its legitimacy requires more effort than shaping its margins. Oversight hearings address performance metrics instead of underlying authority. Momentum favors continuity. This realignment does not require consensus. It requires normalization. As the framework settles, opposition fragments and coordination strengthens among institutions that benefit from stability. As policy lines redraw, the effects extend into practical domains, where systems meet hands-on work. Independent repair under monitoring. Independent repair operates on access. Tools, diagnostics, and modification depend on clear boundaries. Monitoring introduces a new layer that complicates those boundaries without banning activity outright. Systems must remain compliant even as work is performed. Shops adapt by navigating additional requirements. Documentation increases. Verification becomes routine. Certain modifications require additional steps to ensure compatibility with mandated systems. None of this stops repair. It slows it. That distinction matters. Aftermarket development adjusts as well. Parts must account for integration rather than isolation. Compatibility becomes a selling point. Smaller producers face higher barriers, while larger suppliers absorb compliance costs more easily. The result is subtle consolidation, not through prohibition, but through friction. Independent work remains possible, yet more constrained. Each added step discourages experimentation without formally restricting it. This environment rewards standardization. Creativity yields to compatibility. Over time, that shift reshapes the ecosystem around service and modification. As requirements harden, flexibility narrows without ever being banned outright. Shops adapt, builders adjust. What once encouraged experimentation now favors predictability and approved pathways. With systems embedded across policy and daily practice, attention naturally turns away from innovation and toward compliance. That quiet pivot marks the boundary that has moved, separating mechanical freedom from managed operation over time for everyone involved. The line that moved. This change does not announce an ending. It marks a repositioning. Mechanical freedom has not disappeared, but it now operates within administrative oversight. The line between ownership and governance has moved. What once relied on trust now relies on systems. What was assumed private is now structured. This does not erase the past. It reframes it. Riding remains possible, but the context has changed. The shift is not dramatic. It is procedural. It replaces discretion with compliance and normalizes observation as part of operation. Over time, that becomes unremarkable. This moment will not be remembered for controversy. It will be remembered for quiet acceptance. A framework introduced without spectacle slowly becomes part of the landscape. No banners, no protests, just forms, updates, and compliance notices. That is how eras actually change. Not through rupture or collapse, but through steady adjustment. By the time people notice what shifted, the shift already feels normal, settled and permanent, woven into daily routine. That process rewards systems, institutions, and authority over individual discretion. So let me ask you straight. Would you ride a bike that reports what you do? Or do you think this 2026 rule is the start of something bigger? Tell me in the comments and include what you ride now. If you got value out of this breakdown, tap like, subscribe, and join the crew. I'll keep bringing the receipts, the real-world impact, and the truth riders deserve.